The cargo ship Durance Hall docked at Veyrath Crossing Station at third hour, when most of the station was quiet and the corridors were empty. It was a routine docking. The ship carried machine parts, food supplies, and sealed transport crates from the outer sectors. Nothing unusual on the manifest. Nothing that required extra attention. But when the unloading crew reached the lower deck, they stopped. One of the crates was making a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was soft, a low, broken kind of breathing, the sort of sound that something makes when it is trying very hard to keep going and slowly losing the fight. The crew chief, a broad-shouldered Tyrian named Asev, put his ear close to the crate and listened. Then he stepped back and called the station emergency line without saying a word to anyone else. Within 10 minutes, the crate was open. Inside, curled against the far corner on a thin layer of old cloth, was a newborn Drakithari. A dragon infant. It was small, far smaller than anyone expected a dragon to be at birth, with pale silver scales that had not yet hardened properly, and 4 tiny limbs pulled tight against its body as if trying to hold itself together. Its eyes were half open. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven movements, each breath catching slightly before the next one came. Nobody on the docking crew had ever seen a Drakithari infant before. Most people in the known systems never did. The Drakithari were an ancient species, private and distant, rarely seen outside their own territories. Nobody knew how the infant had ended up sealed inside a cargo crate on a freight ship, and nobody aboard could explain it. There were no records. No travel papers. No parents anywhere on the ship. Just a small, pale, struggling thing that had somehow survived the journey and was now running out of time to survive anything else. The station medical bay responded within minutes. A full emergency team arrived at the docking bay with equipment and a transport stretcher, led by physician Dravashin, the senior Velhari doctor on Veyrath Crossing, tall and precise, with long pale fingers and the calm expression of someone who had handled hundreds of emergencies without losing his composure once. The infant was moved to the medical bay carefully and placed on the examination table under full lighting. Drav ran the first scan himself while 2 other physicians, a Shrovan named Perith and a Selvari named Udo, stood on either side watching the readouts. The numbers were not good. Drav studied the scan in silence for a long moment. Then he ran it again. The results were the same. He set the scanner down, straightened up, and looked at the infant with the focused, unreadable expression of someone doing careful math in their head. Perith spoke first. The biology is too unstable. We have no treatment baseline for Drakithari neonates. No recorded cases. No established protocol. Intervention without protocol creates liability exposure, Udo added quietly. Under the non-interference policy, this case qualifies as terminal. Documented and closed. Drav looked at the infant for another moment. Then he reached forward and switched off his scanner. Agreed, he said. Documented and closed the case. And he walked out. Perith followed. Udo followed. 2 more junior physicians who had come in behind them looked at each other, looked at the infant and followed as well. The doors slid shut. The medical bay went quiet. At the back of the room, near the supply wall where he had been standing since the team arrived, Cole Heron did not move. Cole was not a station physician. He held no medical license for sentient species and had no authority in the medical bay in any formal sense. He was the station's only human veterinarian, brought aboard 2 years ago to handle the care of non-sentient animals kept by passengers and traders passing through Veyrath Crossing. Injured cargo animals, sick pets, the occasional exotic creature someone had picked up in the outer sectors and did not know how to care for. That was his job. That was his classification on the station roster. He was 38 years old, lean and quiet, with steady hands and a habit of watching situations unfold before he opened his mouth. He had spent most of his career in frontier postings, stations and outposts on the edges of explored space where proper medical facilities were weeks away and the nearest qualified specialist was always somewhere else. He had learned in those places that resources were a luxury and waiting was a choice, and that smaller living things did not always survive the waiting. He had come to the medical bay because he heard the emergency call on the open station channel and he had nothing else pressing at third hour. He had stood at the back and watched every physician file in, examine the infant and file back out again. Now he stood alone in the room with the infant on the table and the quiet of the empty bay around him. Beside the doorway stood Senna Vale, the station's Tyrian nurse coordinator, amber eyes, calm face, someone who had worked on Veyrath Crossing for 6 years and had seen most things at least once. She had stayed behind too, though she had not announced it. She stood near the door with her arms at her sides watching Cole. "Cole," she said. Her voice was careful. "You know what they will say if you touch that table. I know, Cole said. You are not classified for sentient patients. Drav will file a report. I know that too. Senna looked at him for a moment. Then you know this could cost you your position here. Cole did not answer that. He was looking at the infant. It was so small. That was the thing that kept registering just how small it was. Its pale chest rising and falling in those shallow, broken little movements. Each breath was an effort. Each one slightly worse than the last. Its eyes were still half open, unfocused, looking at nothing in particular with the glassy patience of something that had been struggling alone for a long time already and was beginning to run out of reasons to keep going. Cole thought about the first posting he had ever worked, a small agricultural station on the edge of the Kelva system, barely staffed, constantly under-resourced. He had been 23 years old and 2 months out of training. A farmer had brought in a young animal, a local species, nothing remarkable, that had been injured in a machinery accident. There was no veterinary equipment suited for it. No medication designed for its biology. The nearest supply ship was 11 days out. Cole had worked through the night with what he had. The animal had lived. His supervisor at the time had asked him afterward why he hadn't simply documented it as unsalvageable and moved on. It would have been easier. It would have been correct, technically. Cole had not known how to explain it then. He still used the same words he had used that night because they were the only ones that fit. I couldn't watch it stop breathing if there was still something left to try. He walked to the examination table. Senna straightened slightly in the doorway but did not leave. Cole looked down at the infant for a long moment. Really looked, the way he always did before he began, taking in everything visible before he reached for a single tool. The pale scales. The uneven chest. The half-open eyes that shifted slightly at his presence, registering him without focus, too tired to react. He reached out slowly and placed 2 fingers very gently against the side of the infant's jaw, not pressing, just resting there. A habit from years of working with frightened animals. Letting them know a hand was present before anything else happened. Letting them know they were not alone on the table. The infant was still. Cole pulled on his gloves. He did not make a speech. He did not look back at Senna or toward the door or think very long about Drav's report or the station roster or his classification. Those were real problems and he would deal with them when they arrived. Right now there was a small living thing on the table that was running out of breath, and he was the only person left in the room. He reached for his scanner and began. I'm going to need your help, he said quietly without turning around. Behind him, after a brief pause, he heard Senna's footsteps cross the floor toward the supply cabinet. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Cole looked at the infant one more time, chest rising, falling, catching, and felt the familiar settled feeling that came when a decision had already been made and the only thing left was the work. Someone has to try, he said softly to no one in particular, and he got to work. The medical bay was completely silent at 4th hour. The rest of Veyrath Crossing had settled into its night cycle. Corridor lights dimmed, most departments running on minimal staff, the low hum of the station's ventilation system the only sound moving through the walls. Outside the bay windows, the stars sat still and cold against the dark. Inside, Cole sat at the small workstation in the corner of the bay with 3 screens open in front of him and a cold cup of coffee at his elbow that he had forgotten about an hour ago. The infant was on the table behind him, connected to a basic life support monitor that beeped softly every few seconds. Each beep was a small confirmation, still here, still going, still fighting. Cole had positioned his chair at an angle so that he could see the monitor's readout from the corner of his eye while he worked. He had not looked away from it for long since he sat down. He had started with the station's main xenobiology database. It was large, one of the most complete public collections in this sector, updated regularly, covering hundreds of species across dozens of systems. He had typed in Drakithri and waited. 41 results came back. He had gone through all of them in under an hour. Most were historical records, cultural notes, diplomatic files, physical descriptions written by explorers who had seen Drakithri from a distance. 3 were basic biological surveys, old and vague, written by researchers who had clearly never examined a living Drakithri up close. None of them contained anything close to medical information. The Drakithri were deeply private about their biology. Whatever knowledge existed about their internal systems, they kept it within their own clans and shared it with nobody. Cole had leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he opened a second screen and started again from a different direction. He pulled up his own personal archive, years of field notes, veterinary records, and research files he had collected across every posting he had ever worked. It was not organized neatly. It was the kind of archive built by someone who saved everything because frontier work had taught him that the file he almost deleted was usually the one he needed 6 months later. Folders inside folders, notes with dates but not always titles, reference images mixed in with treatment logs. He searched for reptilian species with dual respiratory systems. 17 results. He opened all of them. He had worked with 3 of those species directly over the years. 2 were small, nothing close to a dragon infant in size or complexity. But the third was a large semi-aquatic reptile from the Venn system called a Dorith, which he had treated twice at a frontier posting early in his career. The Dorith had 2 separate breathing structures, one standard lung and one secondary respiratory organ linked to a chemical gland near the chest cavity that helped regulate its body temperature in cold water. Cole had leaned forward. He pulled the Dorith file completely open and read through it slowly, comparing each note against what his scanner had shown him about the Drakithri infant earlier. The structures were not the same. The biology was different in important ways. But the basic principle, 2 breathing systems, one linked to a chemical gland, one that could be blocked by gland malfunction, that was close. That was something. He went back to the infant's scan results and looked at them again with fresh eyes. The fire gland. That was what the old xenobiology surveys had called it in passing. A small internal organ present in Drakithri from birth, dormant in infants but biologically active from the very first day of life. The surveys had not explained what it did in newborns. They had simply noted its existence. But Cole's scanner had shown him something the surveys had not mentioned. The gland in this infant was not simply dormant. It was blocked. There was a buildup of dense biological material around the gland's outer wall, the kind of thing that sometimes happened in young animals when a developmental process stalled mid-cycle, like a door that had started to open and then jammed before it could complete the movement. That blockage was pressing against the secondary lung. Not crushing it, but pressing, slowly, consistently, reducing its capacity breath by breath. The primary lung was compensating as hard as it could. But a single lung was not enough for a Drakithri infant. The species needed both systems working together from birth. Without the secondary lung functioning properly, the infant was slowly suffocating from the inside, and no amount of external oxygen support was going to fix that. Cole wrote it all down in careful, plain notes. Then he sat back and looked at what he had written. The problem was clear. The blockage needed to be cleared. The secondary lung needed space to function. In principle, it was not complicated. In practice, he had no idea exactly what the blockage was made of, how dense it was at its core, how the surrounding tissue would respond to contact, or whether the fire gland itself would react to interference in some dangerous way that no existing record had ever documented. He needed more. He pushed away from the desk, walked to the supply room at the back of the bay and came back with a fresh coffee. He stood at the infant's table for a moment, looking down at it while he drank. The infant's eyes were closed now. Its breathing had not gotten worse in the last 2 hours, which was the only good news available. The life support monitor beeped its steady, patient rhythm. Cole put his coffee down and went back to the screens. He sent a message to physician Dravoshan. He kept it short and professional, explained what he had found in the scan, explained his theory about the blocked gland, and asked directly if Drav would be willing to review the data and offer a second assessment. He was not asking Drav to treat the infant. He was asking for 5 minutes of the physician's knowledge. He sent it and waited. The reply came back in less than 4 minutes. The case is formally closed under station protocol. Re-engagement creates liability exposure. I'm not able to assist. D. Oshin. Cole read it once. Then he closed the message and went back to work. At 6th hour, the bay door opened quietly and Senna came in. She was not on shift. She was carrying something under her arm. A battered physical folder, the kind made from pressed material that frontier stations used before everything went digital, worn at the edges and held together with a metal clip. She set it on the desk beside Cole without a word. He looked at it. Then at her. A retired border medic left it in the station archive storage about 12 years ago, Senna said quietly. He had worked near Drakithri territory for a long time. Field notes. Partial. Some of it is an old Selvari script and the translation is not complete. She paused. I'm not supposed to have removed it from archive storage. Then you should probably go home, Cole said. Yes, Senna agreed. She pulled a chair over and sat down beside him. Cole opened the folder. The notes were handwritten, uneven, and clearly recorded in the field under difficult conditions. Some pages were smudged, some entries cut off mid-thought as if the writer had been interrupted and never came back to finish. The partial translation Senna mentioned was done in a different hand in the margins, careful but incomplete, leaving gaps in the most technical sections. But it was real. It was someone who had actually been near these animals, observing them, trying to understand them. Cole read slowly and carefully, marking passages that connected to what he already knew. Senna sat beside him and worked on the untranslated sections with a language tool on her personal pad, filling in gaps word by word. They worked through the rest of the night cycle together in near silence. By the time the station lights shifted to morning, Cole had something. Not a complete picture. Not a clean, verified, step-by-step medical procedure. But a logical path, built from Earth reptile veterinary technique, the Doroth case files, the retired medic's field notes, and his own 15 years of reading animals that could not tell him where it hurt. He believed the blockage could be cleared through careful internal access to the gland's outer wall. He believed the surrounding tissue would tolerate the procedure if the tools were properly scaled. He believed the fire gland itself would not react dangerously if the blockage was removed rather than disturbed. He believed all of this without being certain of any of it. He wrote the full plan out in careful, plain language, every step, every decision point, every risk he could identify and what he would do if it occurred. Then he looked at the infant. Still breathing. Still here. He looked at Senna. "If I'm wrong," he said. "You are not wrong," Senna said simply, still looking at her screen. Cole looked at his notes one more time. Then he stood up, rolled his shoulders and picked up his gloves from the edge of the desk. The infant needed him to move before the morning got any older. He walked to the table and began to prepare. The medical bay was cold at 7th hour. Cole had lowered the room temperature himself before they began. It was something he always did before a long procedure. Cooler air kept his hands from sweating, kept his mind from drifting, kept everything sharp and present. Senna had not complained. She had simply pulled her sleeves down and moved to her position across the table without a word. They had been preparing for 40 minutes. Cole had laid out every tool he planned to use in a clean row on the tray beside the table. Scaled down, carefully selected, each one chosen not because it was designed for this but because it was the closest available match to what this procedure required. A fine-tipped pressure probe originally used for deep tissue work in large frontier animals. A microclearance instrument from the station's general surgical kit, the smallest one available. 2 stabilizing clamps no bigger than Cole's 2 fingers held together. A fluid irrigator set to the lowest possible pressure. Not perfect tools, but real ones in steady hands. Senna had prepared the sedation carefully, working from Cole's notes and her own medical knowledge, calculating the correct dose for the infant's body weight 3 separate times before she was satisfied. Sedating an animal whose biology had no recorded pharmaceutical baseline was one of the most dangerous parts of any procedure like this. Too little and the infant would feel everything. Too much and it would not wake up. She had found a middle point she believed in. Cole trusted her completely on that. The infant lay still on the table now, breathing in the slow, deepened rhythm of sedation. Its pale silver scales caught the overhead light in a soft way, and its small chest rose and fell with the particular gentleness of something deeply asleep. The life support monitor continued its quiet beeping beside them. Cole looked at the infant for one long moment before he picked up the first tool. He had learned this habit from an old veterinarian he had worked under at his very first posting. A woman named Dr. Petra Ness, 30 years in frontier medicine, who had told him on his first week that before any procedure you should stop, look at the patient, and remind yourself exactly what you are there to do. Not the steps. Not the tools. Just the purpose. Keep that clear and everything else follows. Cole kept it clear. He picked up the pressure probe and began. The first part of the procedure was slow and careful, a surface assessment of the area around the fire gland, mapping the exact shape and position of the blockage before he touched it directly. He worked in small, precise movements, checking his scanner readout after every pass, building a picture of the blockage layer by layer. Senna watched the monitor and called out the infant's vitals every 2 minutes in a calm, even voice. Heart rate. Oxygen levels. Secondary lung pressure. She did not add commentary or interpretation. Just the numbers, clearly and consistently, so Cole always knew exactly where things stood without having to look away from his work. The numbers were not good, but they were stable. That was enough for now. The blockage was denser at the center than Cole had hoped. The outer layers responded to the probe the way he had expected. Soft biological material, relatively cooperative, but as he worked deeper the resistance increased. He adjusted his pressure twice, recalculated his approach once and kept going. 40 minutes in, the outer layer of the blockage was clear. Cole set the pressure probe down on the tray and picked up the microclearance instrument. This was the part that required the most precision. The fire gland itself was directly behind the blockage's core, close enough that a wrong movement, too much pressure in the wrong direction, could disturb the gland directly. And what an undisturbed fire gland in a newborn Drakithari did when disturbed was something no available record had ever documented. Cole did not rush. He worked in intervals, 30 seconds of careful movement, then a pause to check the scanner, then 30 seconds more. Senna called vitals. The monitor beeped. The station was completely silent around them. The core of the blockage began to break apart under the instrument's careful work. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the gradual, cooperative way that things sometimes moved when the right approach was applied with enough patience. Cole felt the resistance shifting and easing under his hands and kept his breathing steady and his movements small. Then Senna said, secondary heart rate dropping. Cole did not stop moving, but his attention sharpened completely. How much? 15% below baseline in the last 40 seconds. Still dropping. Cole finished the movement he was midway through. Stopping abruptly in the middle of delicate work could cause more damage than completing it carefully, and then set the instrument down and looked at the monitor. Senna was right. The secondary heart rate was falling in a slow, steady decline. Not a sudden crash, but a direction that, if it continued, would become a crisis within minutes. Cole had read about secondary hearts in Drakithari in the retired medic's field notes. A small regulatory organ, present only in the young, responsible for stabilizing blood pressure and fluid distribution during the fragile first weeks of life. The notes had mentioned it briefly without detail as something to be aware of. They had not mentioned what to do if it began to fail. Cole had 3 minutes, possibly 4, before the decline became irreversible. He did not panic. Panic was a luxury and he had never been able to afford it. He thought fast and clearly, moving through what he knew the way he moved through a supply kit in an emergency, quickly but without throwing things aside. He needed a cardiac stabilization approach suited to a small body with a dual circulatory system and an unknown pharmaceutical tolerance. He had done something close to this before. A Komodo dragon. 8 years ago at a remote posting. The animal had gone into cardiovascular shock during a procedure and Cole had stabilized it using a specific external compression rhythm combined with a low-dose chemical compound that slowed the circulatory system just enough to let the heart regulate itself. The compound was called Verathin-4 in Earth veterinary medicine, a standard item in frontier medical kits, used for shock stabilization in large reptiles with slow metabolic rates. Cole had it in his kit. He had brought his full kit into the bay at the start, old habit, because frontier work had taught him that you never knew what you would need. Senna, he said, already moving toward the kit. Second shelf, blue case. Compound labeled V4. I need 0.3 of a milliliter drawn and ready in 30 seconds. Senna did not ask what it was. She moved to the kit immediately. The compression rhythm, Cole said, pulling on fresh gloves, is going to look unusual. I need you to trust it. I trust it, Senna said, already drawing the compound with steady hands. Cole positioned himself at the infant's lower left side where the secondary heart sat beneath the surface. He placed 2 fingers there, light, feeling for the rhythm the way he had been trained to feel for pulses in animals too small for standard monitors. He found it. Slow. Irregular. Fading. He began the compression rhythm. It was not the standard cardiac rhythm used in most species. It was slower and more deliberate, with a longer pause between compressions designed to let the secondary heart reset between beats rather than being pushed continuously. He had used it on the Komodo dragon in the dark of a frontier supply room with no one watching and no guarantee it would work. It had worked then. Senna administered the compound at exactly the point Cole had calculated. He felt the change under his fingers within seconds. Not dramatic but real. The rhythm steadied slightly. The monitor showed the secondary heart rate stabilizing, holding, and then, slowly over the following 90 seconds, beginning to climb back toward baseline. Cole kept the compression rhythm going until the rate had held steady for a full minute. Then he stopped and stood still for a moment with his hands at his sides, breathing evenly. Stable, Senna said quietly, watching the monitor. Yes, Cole said. He waited another 30 seconds to be certain. The numbers held. Then he picked up the microclearance instrument and went back to work. The final portion of the blockage cleared 11 minutes later. Cole felt it before the scanner confirmed it. A shift in resistance, a sudden ease, the sense of something that had been jammed finally moving the way it was meant to move. He withdrew the instrument carefully and checked the scan. The fire gland was clear. The secondary lung had space. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the infant breathed. It was not a gasp. It was not dramatic. It was simply a breath, full, complete, both lung systems working together for the first time, the chest rising in a way it had never quite managed before. Then another breath. Then another, each one steadier than the last. The monitor's rhythm changed, slower, deeper, calmer. Cole set his instrument down on the tray. He stood at the table and did not move for a moment, just listening to the monitor and watching the infant's chest rise and fall in that new, steady way. Senna let out a long, quiet breath from across the table. Cole reached out and placed 2 fingers gently beside the infant's jaw, the same way he had at the very beginning, the first night, when it had been too exhausted to react. Just a hand nearby. Just the reminder that it was not alone on the table. The infant was still and calm and breathing. Outside the bay window, 3 junior staff members who had gathered silently in the corridor stood watching through the glass without speaking. One of them, young, barely a year on the station, had her hand pressed lightly against the window. Inside the bay, Cole looked at Senna. Senna looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The complaint was filed before the morning shift had fully begun. Cole found out the way most people found out about official things on Veyrath Crossing. Not through a direct message, not through a colleague, but through the quiet shift in how people looked at him in the corridor. A junior technician he passed near the supply bay made brief eye contact and then looked away quickly. 2 physicians talking near the medical wing stopped their conversation when he walked by. Small things. But Cole had spent enough years reading animals to know when a change in the environment meant something had moved. The formal notification arrived on his personal station pad at 9th hour. He read it standing in his veterinary bay with a half-eaten breakfast on the desk beside him. It was written in the careful, neutral language that official station documents always used, language designed to state serious things without appearing emotional about them. The complaint had been filed by physician Drav Oshin. It cited 3 specific violations. First, that Cole Heron, classified as a non-sentient species veterinarian, had performed an internal surgical procedure on a sentient patient without classification clearance. Second, that he had done so without a supervising licensed physician present. Third, that he had acted in direct conflict with an active terminal case closure filed under the station's non-interference with terminal cases protocol. At the bottom, in the same neutral language, it noted that a station medical board hearing had been scheduled for 14th hour the same day. Cole set the pad down. He picked up his breakfast, finished it, and then sat down at his desk and began organizing his documentation. He had been recording everything from the beginning. Every scan result, time-stamped. Every decision he had made during the assessment phase and the reasoning behind each one. Every cross-reference between his Earth veterinary records and the Drakitheri field notes. Every step of the procedure written out in plain language with the logic attached. Every reading from the life support monitor during and after the surgery. It had not been a plan when he started recording. It was simply how he worked. Frontier medicine had taught him that clear records were the difference between learning from an outcome and simply experiencing it. But sitting at his desk now, organizing the files into a single clean document, he understood that the records were going to matter today in a different way. He printed the full document at 13th hour. It was 43 pages long. The hearing room was on the station's administrative level, a plain rectangular space with a long table at the front for the board members and a single chair facing them for whoever was being heard. The walls were bare. The lighting was flat and even. It was designed to feel neither welcoming nor threatening, which somehow managed to feel like both. When Cole arrived, the room was already partly full. The 5-member station medical board sat behind the long table, 3 alien physicians Cole recognized by sight but had never spoken to directly, a station administrative officer named Ren Salas who Cole had met once at a docking event, and a senior Selvari medical ethics representative named Tav Orand who had been on the station for decades and was known for saying very little and meaning all of it. Physician Drav Oshin sat to one side of the room, straight-backed and composed, with a single data pad on the table in front of him. Senna was already seated near the back. She gave Cole a brief, calm nod when he came in. Cole sat down in the single chair, placed his 43 pages on his knee and waited. Drav presented the complaint first. He was precise and thorough. Cole had expected nothing less. He laid out each violation clearly, supported by the station's classification records and the formal text of the non-interference protocol. He did not raise his voice. He did not use dramatic language. He simply built the case the way a physician builds a diagnosis, methodically, without unnecessary detail, moving from evidence to conclusion in a straight line. The conclusion was straightforward. Rules existed for reasons. Classification boundaries existed to protect patients from well-intentioned but unqualified interference. The non-interference protocol existed to provide clear and consistent guidance in situations where intervention was unlikely to succeed and carried its own risks. Cole Heron had violated all of these structures. The fact that the patient had survived did not change what had been violated, any more than a driver who ran a red light without causing an accident had therefore not run a red light. It was a good argument. Cole acknowledged that privately, sitting in his chair with his document on his knee. The board asked Drav several questions. He answered each one cleanly. Then the board turned to Cole. He did not start with an argument. He started by placing the 43-page document on the table in front of the board and asking them to accept it as part of the record. Tav Orand, the ethics representative, picked it up immediately and began reading from the first page without waiting for the others. Cole spoke quietly and without rushing. He did not dispute that he had operated outside his classification. He did not dispute that the non-interference protocol had been active. He acknowledged both things directly and early, because trying to argue around them would have wasted everyone's time and he respected the board too much for that. What he did instead was explain, step by step, exactly what he had observed, exactly what he had concluded, exactly what he had done, and exactly why he had made every decision he made. He connected each step to his documentation. He explained the cross-referencing process in plain language. He described the moment the secondary heart began to fail and what he had drawn on to respond to it and why he believed that response was the correct one given what was available. He spoke for 22 minutes. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the board physicians, a Shroven named Dale Ovis who had not spoken yet, looked down at the document in front of him and said, "You recorded all of this during the procedure itself?" "After each significant step," Cole said. "And in full immediately after the procedure was completed." Dale Ovis looked at the document for another moment without speaking. Then Senna was called to give testimony. She stood up, moved to the front of the room, and sat in the chair Cole had vacated with the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had decided exactly what she was going to say and felt completely settled about it. The board asked her to describe what she had witnessed. Senna described it. She began from the moment the emergency team arrived at the docking bay and moved forward in exact chronological order. She described each physician entering the medical bay. She described each one running their assessment. She described each one setting down their tools and leaving the room. She gave the name of each physician and the approximate time they had exited. She described the room after the last physician left. The infant on the table, the monitor beeping, the empty bay. Then she described Cole walking to the table and putting on his gloves. She did not add emotion to any of it. She did not editorialize or make arguments. She simply described, clearly and precisely, the sequence of events as she had witnessed them. The board could draw their own conclusions. She trusted them to do that. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Drav sat very still on his side of the room. His expression had not changed. But something in his posture had shifted slightly, a tightening that was not quite visible but was present the way tension is always present in a still body. The board deliberated in a closed session for 2 hours. When they returned, Tav Orand read the ruling in the same even tone he had used for every question during the hearing. The board found that Cole Heron had acted outside his formal classification. That finding stood on the record. However, given the complete documentation of methodology, the absence of any licensed physician willing to engage with the case, and the outcome for the patient, the board determined that no punitive action was warranted. The matter was formally closed. Drav left the room without speaking to anyone. Cole walked out into the corridor with his copy of the document under his arm and stood still for a moment, letting the flat administrative lighting sit on him while the day moved around him in the normal way days did. Senna came out behind him. She stood beside him without speaking for a moment. "It is enough," she said finally. "It is," Cole agreed. That night, Cole was walking back through the medical corridor toward his quarters when he passed the infant's recovery bay. He slowed without meaning to and glanced through the window. The infant was sleeping quietly inside, its small chest rising and falling in the full, even rhythm it had found after the procedure. The monitor beside it showed steady numbers. It looked, in the simple way that sleeping things always look, completely at peace. Cole was about to keep walking when he noticed the figure already standing at the window. Drav Oshin stood alone in the corridor, hands at his sides, looking through the glass at the sleeping infant. He was completely still. His expression was not readable from where Cole stood, several feet back in the shadow of the corridor. Drav did not hear Cole stop. He did not turn around. He simply stood there for a long moment in the quiet of the empty corridor, looking at the small living thing on the other side of the glass that had been declared finished and had then, stubbornly and completely, refused to be. Cole watched him for a moment. Then he turned quietly and walked the other way. Some things did not need an audience. The message came through official station channels at second hour on the 5th day. It was short. 3 lines. A Drakithri delegation was en route to Veyrath Crossing. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. The delegation would be collecting the infant currently held in the station's medical recovery ward. No further details were provided. The station director, a careful Velhari administrator named San Arvith, called an immediate briefing for all senior staff. Cole was not invited to the briefing. He found out about the message the same way he had found out about the complaint, through the shift in the station's atmosphere. By midday the corridors felt different. Quieter. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when everyone knows something significant is coming and nobody is entirely sure how to prepare for it. Senna stopped by his veterinary bay in the early afternoon and told him directly. 3 elders, she said. The station has requested full diplomatic protocol. San Arvith has been on communication calls all morning. Cole was checking on the infant at the time, running his standard midday assessment. The infant had been moved to the recovery ward 2 days after the procedure. A small private room at the quiet end of the medical wing, warm, low-lit, with a monitor that beeped gently and a soft padded surface Cole had requested specially because the standard medical table was too hard for something so small. He looked down at the infant while Senna spoke. It was more alert now than it had been in the first days. Its eyes opened fully during his visits, tracking his movements with the slow, curious attention of something that was still very new to the world but was beginning to find it interesting. How are they arriving? Cole asked. Private vessel, Senna said. Docking Bay 1. Full clearance. Cole nodded and went back to his assessment. There was nothing else for him to do except keep doing what he had been doing, making sure the infant was stable and well and ready to be received by whoever came for it. The Drakithri ship arrived at 16th hour. Cole was in his veterinary bay when it docked. He had not gone to the docking level. It had not occurred to him that he had any particular reason to be there, and showing up uninvited to watch the arrival of an ancient dragon delegation felt like exactly the kind of thing that would create more complications than it resolved. He heard about the arrival through the station, not officially but through the way sound and attention moved on a closed station when something remarkable was happening. Conversations dropped. Footsteps in the corridor outside his bay slowed and then stopped entirely for several minutes, which meant people were gathering somewhere nearby to watch something pass. Cole kept working. 40 minutes after the ship docked, his pad chimed. The message was from San Arvitha's office. It was formal and brief. The elder matriarch of the Drakithri delegation had visited the recovery ward and examined the infant. She was now requesting to meet the individual responsible for the infant's treatment. The meeting would take place in the medical wing corridor outside the recovery ward at 17th hour. Cole read the message twice. Then he set his pad down, washed his hands, straightened his work jacket, and walked to the medical wing. The corridor outside the recovery ward was not large. Under normal circumstances it held nothing but a few chairs and the soft ambient light of the medical section. When Cole turned the corner and saw it now, he stopped for just a moment. The 3 Drakithri elders filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with their physical size, though their physical size was considerable. They were large, far larger than Cole had imagined, ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, carrying the particular weight of something that had existed for a very long time and had no uncertainty left about what it was. Their scales were deep and dark, the color of ember and old stone, with a faint pattern that shifted slightly in the light the way deep water shifts. Their eyes were pale gold and entirely steady. They stood without restlessness, without the small unconscious movements that most living creatures made constantly. They were simply still, the way mountains are still, in a manner that made everything around them seem slightly less settled by comparison. Station staff lined the walls of the corridor further back. Physicians, administrators, junior staff, people who had found reasonable professional excuses to be in this part of the medical wing at this particular hour. Nobody was pretending otherwise. They simply watched. The elder matriarch stood at the center of the 3. She was Vrathon. Cole knew her immediately, not from any description but simply from the way the other 2 elders positioned themselves. Not behind her, not beside her in the way of equals, but slightly angled, the way people stand near something they consider the fixed point of the room. She was the oldest of the 3. Her scales were the deepest color, closer to the dark gold of cooling metal than the warmer tones of the others, and her eyes held the particular steadiness of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything the world produced. Cole walked forward and stopped at a respectful distance. Vrathon looked at him. Not briefly, not as an assessment, she looked at him the way very old things look at things, which is to say completely, without hurry, as if she had all the time that existed and intended to use what she needed. Cole met her gaze and waited. After a long moment, Vrathon spoke. Her voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to reach the far end of a corridor. "I have seen the child," she said. Her standard was precise and slightly formal, the way someone speaks a language they learned long ago and have used only occasionally since. "I have seen what was done for it. I have read the station's record of events." She paused. "Every healer on this station turned away from our blood. You did not. I want to understand why." The corridor was completely silent. Cole took a breath. He thought about the question honestly, not about what answer would sound right, not about the audience behind him or the weight of what stood in front of him, but about the actual question which deserved an actual answer. "I couldn't watch something that small stop breathing," he said, "if I still had something left to try. That is what I was trained for. It is what I do." He did not add anything to it. It was the whole truth and it fit in 2 sentences and he did not think it needed to be larger than it was. Vrathon was quiet. The silence lasted long enough that the corridor felt very still. Several of the staff watching from further back shifted slightly. Senna, standing near the wall to Cole's left, did not move at all. Then Vrathon lowered her head. It was a slow, deliberate movement, not a bow in the way most species used the gesture, not submission or greeting. It was something older than both of those things. A lowering of the head from something ancient to something it had decided to acknowledge fully. The kind of gesture that, from a Drakithri elder, had a weight that most formal ceremonies in the known system spent years trying to approximate and never quite reached. She held it for a moment. Then she straightened. Behind Cole, nobody in the corridor made a sound. He heard later, from Senna, that several of the staff had not fully understood what they were seeing until it was over, and that a few of the older diplomatic staff had understood immediately and would talk about it for the rest of their postings. "The child has a name," Vrathon said. "It is Vrail. It is of my direct line." She paused. "You should know this." Cole nodded. "Thank you for telling me." "In our tradition," Vrathon continued, "one who restores the breath of a clanling carries a bond of acknowledgement with the clan. You are not family. You carry no obligation and we place none on you. But you are known to us." She held his gaze steadily. "The Drakithri do not forget the known." Cole did not know what to say to that. He said the only thing that felt honest. "I am glad Vrail is alive." Something moved in Vrathon's pale gold eyes, not quite warmth because warmth was too small a word for what lived in something that old, but something real. Something that recognized what he had said and received it. When the delegation went to collect Vrail from the recovery ward, Cole came as he always did for his final check. Old habit, professional reflex, the last assessment before a patient left his care. He leaned down to look at the infant one final time. Vrail's eyes opened. They found Cole's face with the quiet recognition of something small that had learned, in its very first days of life, that this particular presence meant safety. Vrail reached out one small clawed hand and closed it loosely around Cole's finger. Cole went still. He did not move for a long moment. He simply stayed there, his finger held gently in that tiny clawed grip, looking at the infant that had refused so quietly and completely to stop being alive. Vrathon watched this from across the room. She did not speak. She did not move to hurry the moment or redirect it. She simply allowed it to last exactly as long as it needed to last, with the patience of something ancient that understood, perhaps better than most, that some moments were not meant to be moved past quickly. When Vrail's grip loosened and the small clawed hand settled back down, Cole straightened up slowly. He did not trust himself to say anything. He did not try. He stepped back and the delegation moved forward, and Vrail was carefully lifted and wrapped and held with the full, certain tenderness of a clan that had crossed the dark between stars to bring one of its own home. At the doorway, Vrathon paused. She turned and looked back down the corridor at the gathered station staff watching from the walls. She looked at them for a long moment. Said nothing. Then she turned and walked away with her delegation, and the corridor stayed very quiet long after the sound of their steps had faded completely. The station returned to its normal rhythm the morning after the Drakithri delegation left. Ships docked and departed. Cargo moved through the lower bays. The administrative level filled with its usual quiet traffic of paperwork and scheduling and the 100 small decisions that kept a station like Veyrath Crossing running without anyone noticing the effort involved. The medical wing opened its morning shift at the usual hour. The corridors filled and thinned and filled again in the familiar pattern of a working day. On the surface, everything was the same. But Cole had spent enough years in closed stations to know that the surface of a place and the interior of a place were often two entirely different things. And in the interior of Veyrath Crossing, in the small and quiet ways that actually mattered, something had shifted. He noticed it first on the second morning. He was walking through the lower corridor toward his veterinary bay with a coffee in one hand and his daily schedule on his pad in the other when a voice behind him said, "Excuse me, Cole Heron?" He turned around. The speaker was young, early 20s, still carrying the slightly uncertain posture of someone who had not yet fully settled into their professional skin. She was a junior medic named Finn Holt, assigned to the medical wing's general intake section. Cole had seen her in the corridors before but had never spoken to her directly. She was holding a data pad against her chest with both hands and looking at him with the particular expression of someone who had rehearsed an approach and was now not entirely sure it was going to land the way they had planned. "I wanted to ask something," Finn said. "If that is all right." "Go ahead," Cole said. "The cross-referencing method you used," she said. "Connecting Earth animal biology to an unknown alien species. The way you built the treatment approach without a direct medical baseline." She paused. "I asked Nurse Vale about it. She said I should ask you directly." Cole looked at her for a moment. "What specifically do you want to know?" "How you decided which Earth records were relevant," Finn said. "How you identified the connection points between species that do not share a documented biological history. The logic behind the selection." She looked down briefly at her pad. "I have been reading your documentation from the hearing. The methodology section. I have read it 4 times and I understand the steps, but I want to understand the thinking behind the steps." Cole considered this. Then he said, "Are you free at third hour this afternoon?" Finn looked up. "Yes." "Come to my bay," Cole said. "Bring the documentation. We will go through it." He turned and continued down the corridor toward his bay. Behind him he heard the quiet sound of Finn exhaling. Relief, probably, or the release of tension that comes when something you were not sure about turns out to be simpler than you feared. Cole did not think much about it for the rest of the morning. He had work to do. Finn arrived at his bay at third hour exactly, documentation in hand, and they spent 90 minutes going through the methodology together. Cole explained the thinking the way he always explained things, plainly, without decoration, starting from the basic principle and building outward from there. He told her about the Dorith. He explained the concept of structural analogy, the idea that 2 species could share a biological principle without sharing a biological history, and that recognizing the principle was more useful than waiting for a direct match that might never exist. He showed her how he had moved from the Drakethery scan results to the Earth reptile records in steps, each one supported by the previous one, none of them a leap. Finn took notes steadily throughout. She asked good questions, focused, specific, the kind of questions that came from someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply trying to appear engaged. When they finished, she thanked him and left. Cole watched her go and then returned to his afternoon work without further thought. He found out 3 days later from Senna that Finn had gone back to the medical wing after their session and spent the following evening applying the cross-referencing method to 2 old unsolved cases from the station's archive, species with incomplete medical records that had never been fully treated. She had found partial pathways in both cases. She had written it up and submitted it to the medical wing's senior staff as a research note. Senna told Cole this over a meal in the lower deck canteen, in the same calm voice she used for everything. Cole listened and then said, "Good." Senna looked at him with the expression she sometimes used when she thought he was being deliberately understated. Cole drank his coffee and did not elaborate. On the 4th day after the delegation's departure, Senna told him something else. She had heard it through a colleague in the administrative section, who had heard it from someone on the board support staff. The kind of information chain that existed on every closed station and was generally more reliable than official announcements. The station medical board had opened a quiet internal review of the non-interference with terminal cases protocol. No public statement had been made. No announcement was planned as far as anyone knew. It was simply a review, a formal process of examining whether the protocol as currently written was doing what a medical protocol was supposed to do, or whether it had drifted over the years into something more focused on protecting institutions than protecting patients. Cole heard this and sat with it for a moment. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated in any loud or satisfying way. He felt something quieter than both of those things, the particular feeling of watching a door open a small amount in a wall that had previously had no doors at all. "It might not change anything," he said. "It might not," Senna agreed. "But someone is asking the question who was not asking it before." Cole nodded slowly. "That is somewhere to start." He went back to work. On the 5th day, physician Dravoshin came to his bay. Cole was at his workstation when he heard footsteps in the doorway and looked up. Drav stood at the entrance to the bay with a data pad in one hand and the straight-backed composed expression that Cole had never once seen waver in any direction across the entire time they had worked on the same station. Cole waited. Drav walked in. He did not sit down. He stood across the desk from Cole and looked at the data pad for a brief moment and then looked up. The secondary heart compression technique, Drav said. The interval timing. You determined the rhythm without any Drake-3 cardiac baseline data. He held Cole's gaze directly. How did you calculate the interval? It was not quite a question. It was the way a physician asked something when they had already been thinking about it for several days and had reached the limit of what they could work out alone. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he answered. He explained the calculation clearly and in full, the logic behind the interval, how he had derived it from the Komodo dragon case and adjusted it for the infant's size and the biological differences between Earth reptile and Drake-3 circulatory structure, why he had chosen the specific interval he used rather than a shorter or longer one. Drav listened without interrupting. He made 2 brief notes on his pad. When Cole finished, Drav asked 2 follow-up questions. Cole answered both. Then Drav looked at his notes for a moment. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything about the complaint or the hearing or the 5 days that had passed since the Drake-3 delegation had left the station. He simply gave Cole a single brief nod, small, precise, and entirely genuine, and turned and walked back out of the bay. Cole watched him go. He sat back in his chair and looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he said to nobody in particular, "That will do." The package arrived that afternoon. It was delivered by the station's logistics office with a note saying it had come through the Drake-3 ship's final transmission point before leaving the sector. No sender name. No accompanying message. Just a small sealed case, plain and dark, with Cole's name marked on the outside in a script he did not fully recognize. He opened it at his desk. Inside, resting on a simple dark cloth, was a single scale. It was large enough to fill his palm, smooth-edged and perfectly formed, the deep gold color of something very old, warm to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It caught the light of his bay in a way that made it look slightly alive, as if the color went deeper than the surface. From Vrathon. There was no note because there was nothing that needed to be said. Cole held it for a long moment. He turned it over once in his hands, feeling the weight of it, heavier than it looked, solid and certain, the way things are solid and certain when they come from something that has existed for centuries and knows exactly what it is. Then he stood up and placed it carefully on the small shelf above his workstation, beside his tools. Between his pressure probe and his scanner case, it sat quietly and caught the light and stayed. Cole looked at it for a moment. Then his bay door opened and a child came in, 7 or 8 years old, a passenger from one of the dock transit ships, carrying in both arms a small 6-legged creature with a front limb held at a wrong angle. The creature was making a soft, unhappy sound. The child's face was tight with the specific distress of someone very young trying very hard not to cry in front of a stranger. "It fell," the child said. "I think it is hurt. I did not know where else to go." Cole was already moving out from behind the desk. "You came to the right place," he said in the simple and direct way he always spoke to frightened children and frightened animals, because both needed the same thing from a voice, steadiness and the quiet confidence that the situation was now being handled. He crouched down to the child's level and looked at the creature carefully. "What is its name?" he asked. "Pip," the child said. "All right," Cole said. "Let's have a look at Pip." He took the creature gently, carried it to the table, and began his assessment with steady hands and quiet eyes, the same hands that had worked through the night over a pale dragon infant, the same eyes that had read a situation nobody else would touch and decided that somebody had to. Just a small thing that needed help. Just the work in front of him. Just a human who had learned, a long time ago in a frontier posting far from anywhere, that the only real question in any room where something small and alive was struggling was a simple one. Not, "Is this my classification?" Not, "Is this covered by protocol?" Just, "Is there still something left to try?" And as long as the answer to that was yes, Cole Heron intended to stay in the room. In a galaxy that had learned 100 careful ways to walk away, one human simply remembered how to stay.